All right, I'm here again with economist Bob Murphy, and we are here today to talk about healthcare. Um, this is such a huge topic. There's so much going on, and I mean, it was dysfunctional before COVID, and over the last 4 years, I think that dysfunction has kind of come to the surface more, but it's also literally gotten worse. Um, so it's a little hard to know where to start. I mean, there's so much. Let me just ask you,
Well, can I just say something
yeah,
fast,
yeah,
Bretigne,
yeah,
too,
go
just
ahead.
in response to what you're saying? Because you're right. I co-wrote a book with an ER doctor several years ago at this point, talking about the Affordable Care Act, or what's known as Obamacare, and that I just thought if they don't get rid of this, it's gonna totally drag down the whole system. So it's just funny that I thought it was like put a fork in it even before COVID hit. So
Right. I mean, who would have guessed that it could have gotten, this much worse? And I will link to that. I'll link to that too. Um, there are so many issues. There's medical licensing, there's insurance, there's the regulatory agencies, there's Obamacare. Um, if you could sort of articulate what needs to happen, where do we need to be, not necessarily how to get there, but where should we be aiming? What if we wanted to fix healthcare, make it actually, functional and so that it's serving people, what should that look like?
okay, sure. And again, with like you say, this is such a huge topic, and I know we don't have 7 hours to go through this stuff,
Yeah.
so it's a little bit difficult to know where to begin, and how much detail to get into. But let me just make some observations, just to kind of frame the issue. So, nobody says in the United States nowadays that, hey, there's a party. We're all meeting at Joe's house on Friday. Do you want to swing by and stuff? No, I can't. Oh, why not? Because I'm in between jobs right now, and so I don't have car insurance. Because my car insurance is tied to my employer. So right, no one talks like that, right? Like you can, I mean, unless it was a financial thing, but the point is your car insurance isn't tied to your employer. But yet it is commonplace for people to say, "Oh yeah, I had this elective procedure I was going to have done, but you know what? I'm in between jobs. I'm changing jobs, and so I have to wait until I get my health insurance back." People do talk like that, and especially it was true before the Affordable Care Act, when it was you didn't have the guaranteed option. So I'm just trying to isolate that something's odd about that, and so it's when we talk about these things, so it's not just a matter of insurance. It's something about health insurance, right? Because you don't the car insurance you have, the fire insurance on your house, things like life insurance. None of those are tied to your employer; those are separate things, and yet health insurance is like that. And then also, just to stress that there's something I think part of what's going on right now, and why the prices are so crazy, and it feels like it's a fake system, is it's not a business transaction. That you, as the patient, you're not the customer of the doctor or the hospital or whoever you're dealing with. You're this annoying thing, and the actual people paying the bills are a combination of the government and private health insurers. So they're the actual customer from the point of view of the medical provider. And again, you are just, it's like you're a 6-year-old kid going to a private school. The parents are really the customers. The kids just, this person that has this plays some role in the system but isn't really relevant, isn't a decision maker by any stretch. And that's kind of what's happening. And when you think of it that way, you realize why it's unfolding like this. And imagine, just as an analogy, if that was the way we paid for new cars, that your job typically had a program in place, and that every time you needed a car, you just went to the lot and picked one, and then some third party insurance company paid for it. And ultimately, money was taken out of your paycheck in order to fund the premiums for that, but you didn't directly. And the car dealer would sell you the car, and you wouldn't even know how much it cost until after you bought it. I think in a system like that, the quality of the cars would be lower and the prices would be crazy if you had to buy a car and you didn't even know how much it would be until you already bought. And yet that's how our healthcare system works right now. And so again, I'm just trying to isolate. So it's nothing intrinsic to medical care per se. It's this crazy system we have, and that's what's producing these results. And the way to realize it's not about medical care per se is if there's like strictly cash practices, like Keith Smith of the Oklahoma Surgery Center.
Yeah.
or other things that are real, like certain types of cosmetic surgery that aren't typically covered by insurance, and it's just a cash thing. Like the laser eye surgery things that now you can like, get at the mall or something as they get better. Those types of things, that seems like a normal business. Like you go into a waiting room, it's very pleasant. You don't have to wait 2 hours to get in. You get in and get out. It's cash, boom. And why is that? It's because again, that's like a real business. You are the patient, you're the customer, you're the client. It's all rolled into one, and that's why it seems like a normal business. Where it's the other system where it's the payments disconnected from you as the customer that I think gives these perverse outcomes. So I just want to kind of frame it like that to get people to realize that it's not that there's a problem with healthcare per se because of its nature. It's the way the system is dealing with it that's producing these weird outcomes.
Yeah, and it's also a little weird that we call it insurance because it's not, insurance in the traditional sense is you pay some premium in order to protect yourself against some unforeseen outcome.
Right.
And that's not really what you're doing with health insurance. It's so even that, it's like, well, we call it insurance, but it's really this weird system we got. It's not quite socialized medicine. It's not quite, government provided healthcare. It's not that, but it's also not insurance. So it's this weird sort of thing that we've got going. So okay, so that's one thing that, maybe we should do away with that. But then we've got like these regulatory agencies, and RFK Jr., for example, is running on this platform of reforming healthcare, medical freedom, bringing choice back to individuals. And he talks about how he's going to clean up the regulatory agencies. Um, is that something he can do?
I mean, I don't know in terms of like what his exact proposals are, and if you mean like would the president have the authority to do that, or would he need congressional approval? That stuff I'm not as sure of. But in terms of like an incoming administration, if it had the cooperation of Congress, what sorts of things could they do? Yeah, and a lot of this all ties together. So partly why, just to go back to your earlier point, you're right. It's not like you go in every time you get an oil change and a tire rotated that your car insurance pays for that. And if it did, then your car insurance premiums would be a lot higher, right? And then so you're right that we are getting this, and partly why that happens is because normal medical care now is so expensive that a lot of people like, geez, I can't do both. I can't pay these huge premiums and pay out of pocket except for catastrophic things. And so that's why you get in this like sort of worst of both worlds where you're paying really high premiums, plus there's still a big deductible, but then so if we could bring down the cost of the actual, you know, medical services, then that would make it more affordable. And so people wouldn't, need insurance to cover so much. So a lot of this stuff all kind of, plays together that if you had an improvement in one area, that would help improve the other side too. But yeah, to answer your question, I mean, for example, the FDA, and I know, Brittany, that I think probably we would say a lot of the treatments being brought to market by pharmaceutical companies are actually not good for people. But to the extent that some of them may be, the amount that's paid, like to bring a new drug to market now, it's over $1 billion in just
Right.
research and development. And it's not
Prohibitive.
because,
Yeah,
they're doing
you're
so
not.
much testing and it's because of the hurdles and everything.
Yeah.
And they have to like, it's, analogy is people are saying to like, if an oil company's drilling for oil, like they drill a bunch of test wells because they don't know exactly where the deposits are. And then once one hits, then they really develop that one. So it's likewise, the drug companies have lots of different things in play, and then only some of them are going to hit and finally make it over the hurdle, that which can take several years to then be able to bring it to market. And so again, it's a vicious cycle where that's partly why they have to charge so much for the ones that do make it. And it also means they're only going to develop products that, have a wide market, that someone's got some kind of, rare disease. There's no money to be made. But
Right.
again, that's not just, hey, that's capitalism for you. That's no, that's hyper regulated capitalism. So that's part of it too. And by the way, too, also the FDA makes mistakes coming and going, that not only do they put up a lot of barriers for things that, could potentially be helpful, but they also approve things that they shouldn't have approved. So like Vioxx is the classic example. And I'm
Right.
just saying that because a lot of times, like a lot of free market economists I think, fall into the trap of just complaining about, look at all the roadblocks the FDA is putting. But again, it's the opposite error too, where the public thinks something's safe because the FDA said so, and it gets approved, and then all the institutional incentives are in place. If the FDA approves something, they don't want to then later backtrack because it looks like they made a mistake, and then any deaths that occurred were their fault, as it were. So it's
Yeah.
this perverse thing where they give their blessing to something and then are very reluctant to admit when they were clearly wrong and they shouldn't have done that. So it's really, like I say, the problem on both ends of the spectrum for that. So things like that, medical licensing. Now, a lot of that, yes, it's like at the state level and how that works. But I mean, people can see it with something goofy like African hair braiding. There's cases where
Yeah.
the local regulators, the other hairstylists won't let someone open up a shop and do that. You can't get a license. And clearly that's not because they're protecting the public from
Yeah.
incorrect hair braiding. It's they're protecting their own turf and they're raising, their own
You know,
revenues.
when medical licensing was first proposed, when the AMA came in and started really pushing for it, they were explicit that that was their goal. They were explicit in
Mhm.
saying that, our doctors aren't making enough money.
Yeah.
They're not, being treated as the paragons of society that they should be. They don't have their proper place in economic life. We've got to put a stop to this. We've got to cut down the number. There are way too many doctors for the population. That was their goal. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about all the stuff that, is now used to justify licensing. They were really upfront about that.
Right. Just like during the Great Depression, a lot of the official rationale, some of the New Deal policies was explicit, like railing against cutthroat competition, oh, and how can legitimate business people, earn a living when you've got these, other people coming in and dumping in the market. So you're right. They're the same, like they were literally saying, no, we want to restrict competition to raise prices that the public has to pay for these goods and services. And
Yeah,
yet, they were trying to frame it like they were the heroes. So
right.
yeah, and that's some of the stuff I cover, in the book that I mentioned. What was it? The Flexner report came out and
Yes. Yeah.
really got the public up into a tizzy and tried to justify, hey, we need to have higher and in the abstract, that sounds great to have high standards. A good analogy that I think Milton Friedman came up with that I think is pretty good in this context. I don't know if he was talking about healthcare per se or he was talking about something else, but I adapted it for this. That if suppose the government passed a law saying any new car has to be a Mercedes or better, or Cadillac or better, whatever good nice car you want to pick.
Mm.
So yeah, there's a sense in which, oh, well, that's good. So then everyone who's driving is in this really nice vehicle, and that's pretty good, right? But then, of course, the downside is that means the cars are going to be more expensive, and so now there's plenty of people who could have afforded, a less fancy car. Now they got to take the bus or something because they just don't have a car. Period. And so, likewise, yes, other things equal, if there's a rule saying for anyone to practice medicine, they have to meet these minimum standards, and if you make the standards more stringent, then assuming they made sense, like we're kind of given the benefit of the
Right.
doubt,
That's a big.
then yep, on average, anybody seeing a doctor, you would be more certain that that doctor's service, would be qualified and it would be good, but it would be more expensive because you're restricting the supply. And so it's not obvious, even if you did it right, that you're helping people on net,
Yeah.
because again, anyone who wanted to really, people could voluntarily do this. Someone who said, no, I'm willing to pay more to go to a doctor who went to a legit school. And I know you have the freedom to do that if the government isn't enforcing it, right? But what they are doing is they're taking away the option of people of paying a lower amount for a doctor that maybe doesn't come from the school. But what's funny is I almost don't want to fall in the trap of saying that because that makes it sound like
They're
we're
legitimate.
getting great medical care now because the government has those standards in place. But that's obviously not the case. Why would we expect a bunch of politicians to know how to pick doctors better than people left to their own devices? So again, like I say, with the FDA, with the Viac scandal, just showing it, the problem's not merely that, oh, they're making medical care too good and too expensive. No, they're making it expensive, that's for sure, but it's not obvious that the quality of care is better now than in a system where we had more like private watchdogs.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned the Flexner report. I mean, it's pretty clear in hindsight, when you look at how that was, how that was implemented, when the report came out, it was damning against everyone who was competing against the pharma centric school of thought. And so
Mhm.
they shut down what's now considered sort of alternative medicine. They also shut down schools that were teaching African Americans and women. Those, happened to be the ones that didn't meet the standards. So just historically, it's hard to make the argument that it was about improving standards, or that regulation actually improves standards. But I think your point's really important. Even if it even if that is what it was doing, even if it was, raising this bar and saying, well, if you're going to be in the market, you've got to meet this high standard, you're then cutting a bunch of people out. You're cutting out a bunch of customers. Um, the example that comes to mind, I remember when I lived in Hong Kong, there was the walled city was this place where it was like a no man's land. It wasn't ruled by China or Great Britain. It was just this sort of free place. And on the bottom level, there were all these unlicensed dentists who had like come in from China and set up shop, totally not licensed. And if you had a problem with them, I mean, I don't know how they would even deal with that, because Hong Kong didn't have jurisdiction over them. China, nobody had jurisdiction over
Mhm.
these dentists. And yet they were doing a thriving business because there were enough people who, wanted to pay, bargain basement, prices to come and get their teeth fixed. And, apparently they did a good enough job that they were still in business, but, completely unregulated, unlicensed. And, why shouldn't there be that option? Why shouldn't people be able to go and, yeah, I'll go to Joe's GP practice care, who just, kind of read about it on the internet and put together his own practice, and he's going to charge $1 an hour. Why shouldn't people have that option? As crazy as it sounds, because as you say, there's still the other option. You can still pay and get better quality care. Um, this idea that people shouldn't have the option to choose shoddy service should they want to. But I also am wary of, saying too much about that argument, because it presumes that what regulation does is, up the quality. And I don't think there's any evidence for that.
Yeah, yeah. So great points. Let me just respond to a few things you said. So yeah, on the point about in the wake of the Flexner report, yeah, they were shutting down, I guess like what we say, homeopathic remedies and
Homeopathy
things.
and Native American
Yeah,
and
and that some of the people like caught up in that tended disproportionately to be, the not as powerful people at the time, and that makes sense. So there's a similar thing in 1931. They passed was the Davis-Bacon Act, and if you just read the text of it, it says, "Oh, for government projects, they have to pay the prevailing local wages." In other words, so the government wants to go build a bridge or something somewhere, and they're taking out bids from the local contractors. And the idea was, if a contractor comes in with a low bid, but you look and see he's not paying the prevailing wages of that region, you can't take that bid. So it's not just the lowest bid. And so oh yeah, that's good for helps the workers. And what that was doing, it was making sure just white union workers got the contracts, right? Because that the union like determined what the prevailing wage was. And so if you were a black crew that wasn't unionized, how would you compete? Well,
yeah,
your men probably didn't have the experience and the training that the white guys did in 1931, through no fault of their own.
yeah,
And so how would you compete with them? You'd have to just do it for a lower price. And yet the government was making that illegal. Right. And so, and this isn't just pure cynicism. Like you can go see at the time, at least some of I'm not saying everyone who voted for it was racist, but some of the people in supporting it, you could like on the House floor or whatever, were clearly saying, this will ensure that government, taxpayer money goes to, I don't remember the exact language, but they weren't beating
people.
around the bush. They were explicitly
Wow.
saying, so anyway, just that's one example of this kind of thing that you see this pattern a lot. Um, and also too, like with the hair braiding example we said a minute ago, that that policy obviously is having disproportionate effects in terms of racial pay among hairdressers in that region. So yeah, you're right. Again, just to make sure people aren't missing the point that if the government comes in and sets a threshold like and restricts the supply in the name of and according to the rationale of improving quality, even if what they were doing actually did improve the quality, it's not obvious that's helping anybody, because again, it's the only people you would be helping are like those who really have no frame of reference. They have no ability or willingness to judge quality on their own. And, so that kind of a thing, that maybe you could make an argument that if there's this bare minimum, but like you're saying, like if they just said, hey, you know what, we're going to just randomly say half of the current brain surgeons need to drop out. That would also restrict the supply, but there's no reason to suppose the half that remained would be a higher quality than the half they kicked out. And so I'm saying, like, just the mere fact that you're restricting supply doesn't prove, and especially for people who now, doing more research and whatever, it looks like a lot of these alternative medical treatments might make more sense, or at least for certain people, than what the, standard scientific, and this is what you do, and what you got a problem, we'll go get a pill for you. That's,
Right, right,
changing your diet, that's hippy dippy stuff. Like,
right,
no, that it seems more and more people are real. But the point is, it doesn't matter. We don't, whether you think it's not. It's like, wouldn't a system be more robust if it were open ended? And you just said, let the evidence go where it may, and then yeah, if it does turn out that some of these therapies are, woo woo or whatever, okay, well then people probably will stop going to them over time. But you don't want to give the government the power to just pick and choose. Nope, this is the right way, and anyone else is wrong. Like, once you do that, if they happen to choose wrong, and again, why would we expect politicians to pick the right ones, even if they wanted to? They're no more trained than
right.
the
Even if
public
they're
is.
not corrupt and
And but yeah, like you say, then behind the scenes too, they're getting campaign contributions at the very least from certain groups. So why would we expect that to be an unbiased choice?
yeah. And what's interesting to me about that history is, at that time, prior to the Flexner report, there was this war between like what we now call the allopaths and the homeopaths, and the allopaths being the ones who were starting to use, back then it was called patent medicine. It's
Mm-hmm.
medicine that you could patent and then sell. What's interesting to me about that is that the economics of selling patent medicine is very different from the economics of like herbal medicine or homeopathy or
Mm-hmm.
like traditional Chinese medicine or something, because you can't patent those things. And so you can't make the big profits. And what it looks to me like what happened is these folks who were making medicines that could be patented, pharmaceuticals, they were able to make a lot more money. And were then what they did was they went to the politicians and said, hey, can we, let's have this partnership and we'll, pay you essentially, which is still going on today. It seems to me that patents are sort of a central part of that. Like if they didn't have the power to patent their products, they wouldn't have these enormous profits, which they could then use. They have the advantage of, in the market of buying politicians, they have the advantage over, the vitamin sellers or the herbal remedies. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a great point. I don't know that I've thought of it from that angle, but yeah, I think you're right to understand that history and how do they have the ability to do that. Um, I mean, it's funny. There's a thing in economics called Baptists and bootleggers, and it, for people who don't know that term, it's an economist did a study like trying to show historically who were the groups supporting alcohol prohibition, when that was in force.
Huh.
And he summarized by saying Baptist and bootleg. So Baptist meaning, of course, there was the religious, the teetotalers who really didn't want, alcohol to be allowed. They thought it was bad for society and, against God and whatnot. But then the people who were in the bootleg industry were making a bunch of money by selling moonshine. And so they also behind the scenes were actually, so somebody might have originally thought, oh, the people who would be most in favor of drug legalization would be the drug dealers. No, they're the last people, because they
Right.
know they would go out of business. If you're a heroin dealer right now, then you're not going to be the CEO of a reputable company 10 years into it. If it's legalized, it's going to be somebody else who's got a different skill set than you do.
Yeah.
So yes, in a similar vein, then you just, that same thing, that it's right, the people supporting. And of course, it's not that they need to send lobbyists who say, hey, we have these drugs that we just spent a bunch of money developing, and so we want you to make it illegal for people to compete with us, even though our drug is no better than vitamins. That's not what they're saying. They're going to give, research and whatnot to try to make reasoned arguments in defense of the public. But it's sort of like, I think with a lot of stuff, Brittany, that the rise of Uber, and Lyft and whatnot, and Airbnb really helps the public to see that our arguments make sense, because we can see in the case, when like the taxi cab drivers are
Right.
saying, oh no, Uber shouldn't be allowed because, the public, you might get into it and the guy might be an axe murderer. And people just realize, well, no, that's not happened. They have a system in place that, there's ratings and stuff. So if the guy really is a terrible driver or whatever, the car's awful, he's going to be quickly weeded out of the system. And it's just so much cheaper and convenient. And anyway, we don't believe you. The reason you guys are lobbying against Uber is so you can charge more for cab rides. It's not because you care about the public.
And
And so you see a similar thing here.
before Uber existed, they would make very well-reasoned arguments about why there had to be this medallion system.
Right. Right.
And why, we've got to limit the number of taxis. And I remember writing about this, years and years ago. And it's like, when you really look at it, it actually doesn't make sense. But I think until people can see with their own eyes the alternative, it's like, oh yeah, the medallion, that makes a lot of sense. You gotta keep the streets,
Right.
clear of all these cars. You can't have too many taxis, all this.
Right.
And it's like, but once you see, that once the reality changes and you see, oh, it's working just fine without that, it seems ridiculous.
Yeah. And so again, like I understand people. I'm guessing the listeners of your audience, Brittany, are pretty open minded about this stuff. But like the average person, I get it. If they heard our discussion from 10 minutes ago, would think, so anybody can just put a sign on their window saying brain surgeon, $10 a pop, and the public's going to go. And so first of all, probably, somebody who would willing to go to just some random person on the street and get a brain surgery done, that's hey, they probably got a brain tumor. But beyond that, like so where you're going to go, you're going to go to a hospital. They're going to have brain surgery. So the hospital is not going to hire Joe Schmo, who failed out of high school to be given brain surgeries, in their ER. Because in the hospital, even if there's not medical liability, they're going to go out of business, right? If we're talking about a more, business oriented system. And so I guess so some of these crazy cases, and like you said, for something that's less risky, like just having somebody check, oh wow, my tooth is killing me. I need someone, like you're talking about in Hong Kong. Well, then there, maybe you would take the chance of doing something. And if you have a bad thing, well, the person's not going to die. And then they're going to tell all their friends, and then we're going to minimize the damage. And again, you can always come up with scenarios where something bad's going to happen, but bad things happen with the current system. Just to
Right.
give an example, people might realize that there's been a proliferation, at least where I've been living in the last several years, of urgent care centers. And you need those had to spring into existence because now, even if you have a pediatrician and your kid's sick, you can call them up and they're like, yeah, we can see you in 3 weeks. And it's like, well, the kid's sick right now. And
Yeah.
so, oh yeah, take them to urgent care. So I'm just saying, and the standards I think for that are lower than other things. People might be worried about, oh, but you know what? If your kid's sick, you need someone to see him, and it's you can turn to Google, but and also too, I should mention last thing. I know I've been going here, but part of why everyone has to go to see somebody is because you can't just get prescriptions filled without having a doctor prescribe them. So that's part of what keeps everyone locked into this crazy system too. Is that if you had more, and it's not just you. Like, my wife had a certain thing she needed for a nebulizer because she has the lung issues, and when we were traveling in Europe, she ran low, and I was like, "Oh no, what are we gonna do?" And we just went down to the pharmacy, and they gave it to us. I mean, we paid for it, but we didn't need a doctor to give us whereas in the U.S. you would have needed a prescription to get that refilled. So I'm just saying things like that, and people might have been surprised by it, thinking, "Oh yeah, socialized med." Well, in at least the country we were in at the time, it was easier to get stuff there than in the good old United States with its wild west in healthcare.
Right. And let's just talk a little bit about the whole prescription thing. I mean, it's something that people, I think, don't really question, but I think it's insane that I have to go to another adult to get permission to get medications for my child or for myself. I think that's insane. And yet here we are. And as you say, what happens if, if you need something urgently? We actually had a thing come up recently where we got sent the wrong medication. And then it took several days. We had to give our daughter the wrong medication for a few days, and it caused problems.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I'm just sitting here thinking, I should be able to just go to the store and buy this and get as much of it as I want and have it in stock so I don't have to wait until my permission clears. And I mean, it's just when you think about it, it's pretty nuts. And yet people have come to accept it.
Yeah,
Why prescription? I mean, why does that even exist?
yeah, and just to get one specific illustration of just the absurdity and the horror, I think for certain people, chronic pain patients
Yeah.
They really have had a roller coaster the last several years because, with the opioid uh crisis and doctors over prescribing, they would say, and I get that, but then there was the crackdown on that, and so then doctors were very reluctant to prescribe painkillers even to people who just went through like a bad surgery, or just again someone who
People who
has a
really,
condition where they're really constantly in pain,
yeah,
and just to function and not want to jump off a bridge, you need. And a lot of them got cut way down just because the
yeah,
doctor was afraid, no, if it looks on paper like I'm just passing out opioids, I could lose my license. And
right.
so, anyways, I'm just saying there's lots of things like that where for people who are in generally good health, they might not realize just how crazy some of these outcomes in the system are. And
Yeah,
again, this is in the United States. It has its reputation of being laissez-faire healthcare. No, it's not.
nothing close to it. Yeah, nothing close to it. Yeah, yeah, if you're in good health, I think you don't realize how much control they have and how when you really need something, you're at their mercy. You're really you are. And you mentioned licensing again too. I think we've seen over the last few years how licensing is really used as a tool of control. How it's really, as with, the FDA or anything else, I don't think it has anything to do with quality. It has to do with this is a way that we can make sure that doctors toe the line, specifically in the last few years with regard to like unapproved treatments for COVID, ivermectin, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
I don't know if you've been following the case of Meryl Nass
I
in,
haven't.
but she had her license stripped because she was giving ivermectin to patients because she was, basically trying to save their lives.
Hmm.
Other doctors have had their licenses threatened because they talk about the risks of the COVID vaccine or, you know, things that are clearly politically motivated that are they're like, you're not towing our line. And so we're going to take away your permission.
Yeah.
Again, why does anyone have that power?
Yeah, and it was on going the other way too, Brittany. Maybe this is on your radar too, but in the beginning, when COVID first started becoming a thing, there were some researchers off the top of my head, I don't remember the details, in the United States, so that they had what they thought were, rough and ready COVID tests, so that all the people saying, oh, right when an outbreak begins, if you could just isolate it and contain the people, you would save so many lives. And Donald Trump just sat and refused to do. And no, what happened early on was there were some people who had, crude tests ready to start testing people, and the FDA, well, I think it was the FDA, told them, no, you're not allowed to use those tests. You have to use the ones that we approve. And
Right.
so if people, again, this narrative has arisen from the left about the US did nothing and, would put their head in the sand. And no, some people were trying to do early reaction, and the
Yeah.
government literally told them you are not allowed to test people. And
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
it wasn't like they were going to be quarantined. There was no coercive power. It was just a matter of, hey, there's this new thing, and it would probably help if some people, we could tell them you tested positive, maybe you want to stay home. Not that we're going to force you to, but just so you tested
Yeah.
positive for this thing that we think came over and could be a deal. And no, the government said, no, you're not allowed to do that.
Yeah.
Only the tests that we develop.
Yeah, yeah, I remember that. There were several labs that had developed, and they could use them internally. They just couldn't ship them out. They couldn't let anybody else. It was yeah, yeah. So assuming those tests were a good thing to have, not so sure now, but
Yeah, like I said, yeah, I realize, there's a whole big thing, but again, even the people who are trying to say, oh yeah, it was the inaction and Donald Trump dragging his feet, and I would say, no, there were several
yeah,
things where even in your own worldview, the government prevented people from doing what you would have thought was the right thing. So
yeah, it's the regulatory state doing what it does. Um, what do we do? Like, what do you think? Ideally, what would a
sorry, can
free?
I say one last quick thing?
Yeah, 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 go ahead.
I knew a guy, he's a doctor, I forget, he like puts stents in people's like that, like so he's a heart doctor. And when COVID was first hitting, he went because he had contacts with like people in China, and he was going to get, what is it, K95s, and he masks, which are not the same thing as N95. And so but it was right, you remember when there was this shortage, and like
Yes, yes,
people
everyone.
were going into hospitals and putting like towels around their face, and what I mean, certain hospitals just had a
Plastic
short.
bags.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so he was like, for free, he was going to give for free. He was contact like and he had to, on Facebook, he had to use like code to tell other people, hey, if you have a hospital that's willing, I have crates full of K95s, sealed from the manufacturer that
Yeah.
I will just give to you. And Facebook was shutting it, like making it so he couldn't easily communicate that in all the local hospital. Like I even reached out, like I knew some people like through my wife who worked, and nobody took them up on it. Like, no, we're not. So because no, we need N95s and for the healthcare workers, and so it ended up that they were like you said, reusing masks and or just putting plastic instead of a K95 because no, that's not allowed, and it was just insane. Again, I know there's people like saying with the studies about the mask, but I'm just saying even in their own mind they thought
Right.
masks were essential, but no, the rule says it's got to be an N95 for the healthcare workers, so we can't take these. It was just insane.
Yeah, yeah. Let me just go off on one little tangent. It may not be that little. Um, so one of the things that happened during COVID that, it's probably still happening. Um, there are all these cases. I don't know if you've seen all the accounts of people who were kind of coerced into taking remdesivir, coerced into being put on ventilators, not given care. What it looks like, and I don't want to get too accusatory, but what it looks like is, the hospitals had financial incentives to have people die from COVID. And they were getting money from the government, and there was specific bits of that money were earmarked for died of COVID.
Hmm.
And so there are these accounts coming out now of people who were like flat out denied care, like left in rooms with, starved, no water, just, I mean, I don't know another word for it than murder. I mean, it looks like people were killed in hospitals. Um, in my mind, a healthcare system doesn't really get much worse than that. That's like kind of the worst thing that can happen. And it looks like that was happening and
Hmm.
maybe still is. I don't know. Um, how do you how do you fix that? How do we get from this point of, oh my God, look at this horrific thing that's happening in this system? How do you stop that from how do you fix that?
Well, I think taking the coercion out of all of it. So all these things we're talking about, what ultimately upholds each step of the or each leg of the system is the coercion behind it all. And so, yeah, if the government, for the medical licensing, if the government just wanted to publish a list and say these are the people we approve of, you can go to this website. You want to go see someone. Hey, before you go make that initial appointment, why don't you double check with this list that we maintain at www.blah.gov and what but if you want to see someone who's not on their list, you have the freedom to do it. I'd be okay with that. I mean, it might spend some, they might take taxpayer money or whatever, but it wouldn't be a big deal. The issue is no, you're not allowed to go against what they say.
To be clear, there are already private credentialing agencies. You can get credentialed, even you can, you meet your licensing standard, but then, in whatever specialty you are, you can get private credentialing in that already. So there's no reason to think, if there wasn't licensing, that there would be these credentialing agencies.
Oh, right, totally. I'm just saying that, like, if the government feels like, oh no, the public's too stupid, and I'm
Here's
just
our
saying
list.
that notice the reason that their licensing has teeth. It's not because they're just making a recommendation.
Yeah.
It's because they're saying if we catch you trying to go to a doctor that we don't approve of, he's in trouble and you're in trouble possibly, so
Yeah.
that's the just like in other countries that where they like in Canada or whatever, you can't on the side, even for an approved doctor, if you just on the side want to say, here's some money, can you treat me, that's they've committed a crime in certain some it's like a hybrid where they have a single payer or a government healthcare system, but you can on the side opt out if you want, but in some of them you can't. So I'm just saying that like that's here the US has that too in the sense of if you're not an approved medical practitioner. So that's something, and again, with that's partly how the government had such a stranglehold over the acceptable treatments, like you said, that the case earlier of the doctor using ivermectin, losing her license. So that's the way they can ultimately control. And then that's why, geez, if someone's in the hospital and you go to visit them, for one thing, you might not be allowed to visit them with those
Right.
procedures. So even there, you say, well, gee, how come someone didn't open up a different hospital? Well, because you need to show a certificate of need in order to,
Mhm.
it's not like just opening up a pizza shop. So again, this every element of this whole thing is tightly controlled. It's not a free market, and so then, given that when the government has such tight control over it, don't be surprised if you find yourself not with public opinion on something, and public opinion, of course, is heavily molded
Yeah.
by a smaller group, then you could be in trouble. And that's where you see crazy things like, "Hey, if you're not vaccinated, you should be denied medical care," and
Right.
whereas
Right.
that's coming from the open-minded, tolerant leftists.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Do you think, I think if we talked about some of these ideas like 5 years ago, not having licensing and you know, not having government approval of drugs and that kind of thing, um, it would have been dismissed by, people who are not already on our side. I feel like most people would just think, oh, they're a bunch of lunatics. Do you think
mhm.
that's changed? Do you think there's an opening to have these ideas heard now?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, people saw how the healthcare, the interventions in the medical sector could be weaponized against unpopular groups. And I think that they learned that lesson and they're gonna. I mean, arguably, it's almost the other way that like now, people are like, "Hey, I don't trust anything." I don't even
Right.
know if viruses exist, and and so it's like, yeah. So in terms of trying to get people to just do whatever the government wants and toe the line, it had the opposite effect. Um, so to answer your question, right? I think just like we said earlier that 20 years ago, if you said, "Oh, you know what, the taxi cab medallion, that's an unwarranted government intervention and it makes cab rides more expensive. And don't worry, there could be a free market and there'd be methods of private monitoring of the quality and the driver." And that would sound science fiction-y, like, who cares? What's the big deal? But once you see the alternative, and so then you hear
Yeah.
somebody who might have thought, "Oh, the system basically works, Bob, give me a break." And then when you see what happened, then a lot of people are taking it more serious. Like, oh, yeah, maybe we shouldn't put this kind it's kind of funny that you wouldn't want the government to be just like to have total control over the food supply or something. That's kind of an essential thing. And yet, they do have this very strong grip on healthcare, which is also pretty important for people. Um, it's it's sort of like Brian Kaplan one time. He's a libertarian at cops, and he had this offhand remark on a blog post about you know, that, if you took some of the libertarian arguments seriously, you would think that like drinking water wouldn't be something the state could provide, but it's basically a pretty good at, and then the Flint, Michigan thing came out. And so I said,
Yeah.
actually, no,
Yeah.
it's not the case. The government you don't want them in charge of
They
your
can
local
screw up
drinking water.
anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like you could, as absurd as you could come up with, that's what the government's going to do. And you don't want them in charge of it. You don't want them in charge of your money. Look what happened. You don't want them in charge of the schools. Look what happened. You don't want them in charge of healthcare. Look what happened. You don't want them in charge of your drinking water.
If we waved a magic wand, got government completely out of healthcare tomorrow, um, are there any problems you can foresee? Is there anything that would happen, or even, let's say it happened over, because there's also the issue of, anything that happens instantaneously, there's going to be adjustment issue.
Right, right.
But leaving that aside, if government wasn't involved in healthcare at all, can you think of any problems, any legitimate problems that would create?
Well, certainly if by saying getting it out altogether, you included current government expenditures for healthcare item, if you turn that off next Thursday, that could lead to a lot of issues. Like people who,
Right, or depending.
right now, like older people who have, their whole lives in terms of budgeting and how much are we putting aside for our retirement, whatever, assuming, oh, well, then I'm going to be on Medicare at that point. Like for them, it would be tricky if all of a sudden that got turned off.
Yeah.
Like I say, though, a lot of this stuff, though, I think one of the, I don't want to call it silver bullet, but if you got rid of the mandatory licensing, and again, the reason I'm saying the mandatory, I was saying before about the putting the thing that if the public thinks, oh no, we need some sort of central authority to tell us who's a good doctor, I'm saying, okay, well then
Here's
they
your
can
list.
publish the list. They
Yeah.
can just say if we, according these are the people that meet our criteria. So anybody who likes that system, you can still go to just those doctors. It's just don't force other people who disagree with you or who disagree on the trade-off between the price versus the quality,
Yeah.
don't force them into that same system. Give them the freedom to opt out. That's all it would mean. Just like with the FDA, like there could be the FDA could still give its approval to certain drugs, and then the CVS or whatever could have two different sections. They could even have it, the unregistered or unlicensed ones behind the counter,
Right.
behind glass or something, and maybe only sell those to people who are 21 or older or something. But again, it's just the idea. So you can still have a bifurcated system, and all the stuff that you think the government's giving right now, a lot of that you could get without the coercion involved. So that would bring down prices. That's where I was going with all this, is to say, so that would ease a lot of this. That part of the reason right now it seems like, oh, we need to have massive health insurance coverage and government subsidies, is because it's just so expensive. But no, the reason it's so expensive is because we've got this crazy system where, again, the customer is not the one making the decisions. Like when people who decide to go get some tests or whatever, if you had to pay for out of pocket all the different MRIs and whatever, there'd be a lot fewer of those ordered.
Yeah.
And I know some of that too is like because of the malpractice issues that, a lot of times doctors order a bunch of tests just to have themselves covered. And if there's a more reasonable legal system, maybe, that would be lowered too. So anyway, just opening that up, a lot of the prices would come down, which would make a lot of the other fixes less painful. That, oh yeah, you could end government subsidies a lot more easily if the prices dropped 90%. And by the way, those numbers, I mentioned Keith Smith of the Oklahoma Surgery Center.
Yeah.
That's some, because for people who don't know, it's like a cash practice. And on some, a lot of procedures, he says the cost savings are 90-95% in some cases.
Yeah, they've documented that, and it's a huge difference. I mean, such a difference. People frequently fly in from other parts of the country
Mhm.
just because it's still way cheaper, even with your travel
Yeah.
expense.
And even like taking a week at the hotel,
Yeah,
down the street to recover from the surgery and then fly back, even all in, people saving thousands of dollars and
yeah.
going and doing that. And so, that kind of model just shows that at least for a lot of the more routine procedures, a lot, so these humongous prices that people, when you go to the hospital and you come out, you look at the actual itemized bill and you're just
Oh,
shocked.
yeah.
You're like,
It's
wow, it's a good thing I have insurance. Well, it's partly because you have insurance, the bill
right.
is so
And
high. If they had to actually give that to paying customers, the prices would have to come down because nobody would be paying those figures.
Yeah. Really quickly, because I know we've got to wrap up pretty soon. Because we're talking about insurance, I think there's probably a perception among some people at least that, well, that's just the free market. That's something the market
Mhm.
came up with. How did we end up in this with this weird insurance model? How did that happen?
Sure. So it's great question. I'll try to give a quick answer. Again, a lot of it. This is a great illustration of Ludwig von Mises had this idea of like the logic of interventionism and how one intervention causes problems that then justify the next round, and then you just keep ratcheting up, moving towards outright socialism. So in health insurance in the United States, so one of the things that happened is during World War II, there were wage and price controls, right? So the government's fighting the war, the Federal Reserve is creating boatloads of money to pay for it. They're going through, the government issues bonds and the Fed monetized it and whatever. And so that was pushing up prices. The government didn't want that, so they had wage and price controls, but they had an exception. If a company like offered to cover someone's health insurance as part of the compensation package, that wasn't included with the cap. So that, companies bidding for workers in that period couldn't just say, oh, we'll give you 10% more money, because that would be in violation of the law. But they could say, hey, we'll give you this amount of money in salary and we'll pay for your family's health insurance. So that's partly how that came to be a thing. And then, uh, there's right now, like the tax code has certain provisions that also make it advantageous that if an employer, gives you $80,000 in cash and $20,000 payment for your health insurance, that's, you as the employee are only taxed on the 80%. Whereas if they just gave you 100 grand in cash and said buy your own health insurance and you spent 20,000, you'd be getting taxed on that 20,000.
Yeah.
And so that's another reason, like keeping it locked in, that especially like higher compensation employees would rather their compensation be, allocated. They want the insurance to be provided by their employer rather than them getting
Oh, yeah.
paid and then they shop around and they buy it themselves over the counter.
Yeah.
So things like that, just to give them two quick examples to help show that it's not market forces, it's government rules that have sort of shepherded us into this system. And that's part of the explanation for why it's like that. And then there's lots of, there's rules against interstate competition and things like that, that, help make insurance more expensive than it needs to be. Um, and a lot of stuff too, with like the portability, like you in principle, you should be able to buy a real low frills health insurance plan that just follows you around. But in practice, that's not how, it kind of renews every year. Whereas like you buy a life insurance policy when you're 25 and you keep paying the premiums, even if you develop a brain tumor 5 years later, as long as you keep making those premiums, that policy is still enforced. But with a health insurance, it's not like that. It's going to renew soon enough. So a lot of those, and again, I think it's because there's government rules about what type of policy you need to have, and certainly with Obamacare now,
Right.
it's
Certainly after
built
the
in.
ACA, that,
So,
yeah.
partly, if they could do things like for example, my first son, when he was born, he had a heart murmur, and I was self-employed at the time. This was right before Obamacare came in, and
Mm,
I had the hardest time just getting basic health coverage for him, like in case we got in a car accident or something,
gee,
because I was like, oh, he had a health murmur or heart murmur. And I was saying, well, can't we like have a rider on the
right.
policy saying if it's heart related, it's not covered, but just
Right.
basic catastrophic, and they wouldn't do it. And I think partly it was because they thought if something were to happen, this guy would go before a jury and say, my poor little boy had a heart problem and a big bad insurance company didn't cover it. And so like they wouldn't be, so I'm just saying some of that stuff, I think too, just the legal system, the way it is, and that.
Everyone's afraid of being sued for absolutely
Yeah,
anything.
yeah. So I think that's partly why you can't just get real bare bones catastrophic coverage. Again, now it's literally illegal,
Right.
but
But even before it
even
was,
before is
yeah.
because of things like that. So I'm just giving you some examples to try to explain, why is it that we're in this weird, situation now where health insurance seems to be so distorted relative even to other forms of insurance.
Yeah. Yeah. Just quickly to wrap up,
Mhm.
final question. We have a vision of what needs to happen. We need to get government coercion, get government out of healthcare. Can that happen through the political system? Can a politician do that?
I mean, in terms of like, is it theoretically possible? Yeah, yes. Like Andrew Jackson famously got rid of the second bank of the United States, which was like the Fed of his day. So certainly, airlines used to be heavily regulated in the 1970s, and then there was deregulation. So even though as libertarians we like to joke and say, hey, there's no such, there's nothing that lives longer than a perm or a temporary government program, stuff like that. That yes, there's historical precedent. It is possible to roll back the state in certain areas. I do think though it's really difficult because again, even if any single politician really does have the right vision or whatever, typically the way the system works, they're going to have to work with others, and it's hard to really get that to go through. Um, so I think what I try to do at least is to sketch a vision and to show, this is what a good system would look like, a free society. This is how it would work. And so keep in mind, yes, these government interventions over the years are what's causing the problem. So people know what the heck happened. But
Yeah.
in terms of, where I personally would put my efforts in trying to fix things is developing alternatives where people can kind of opt out of the current system. So like, in monetary the arena, rather than trying to abolish the Fed, even though that would be a good thing, it's more, telling people about Bitcoin and other things and other, financial vehicles you can use, blah, 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 blah,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. And instead of attacking the taxi account, monopoly directly by getting rid of the medallion system, just having Uber and Lyft come through, and then, the
Yeah.
public will just gradually go away. Instead, the post office still has a monopoly on first class letter delivery, but you've got FedEx and UPS, and so that's kind of what I think. So just on the margins, maybe if they could just more liberalize. So I think what's going to happen, maybe this is the way to wrap up for me, is rather than just the government totally shutting down the existing systems that are totally dependent on the government's existence, instead just on the margins freeing up and liberalizing so that allowing people to do these things on the side to give an opt-out
Yeah.
option for people. To me, that's what's going to give the most freedom in the short run, at least. And also too, then to provide an example so then the public can see, well,
Right.
wait a minute, these, that's why I like the Keith Smith example so much, that he's showing this is this isn't, you got to
Yeah.
go read Rothbard, and we can imagine a tropical island where there's free healthcare, or free market healthcare, not that it's
Right. But
their
no, it's
price.
here and it's working.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's what it would be. So politicians, maybe, to be able to, I think what's realistic is they could liberalize certain things and allow competition. Like I said, instead of abolishing the FDA, just maybe saying, oh, within certain classes of things, if your doctor approves, you can get a prescription that's not FDA approved. You know what I mean? That's not total laissez-faire anarchy,
But it's
but
chipping
it's
away.
better than, the current system kind of thing. And then once that's in place, people could check that out after 5 years and be like, huh, the rate of death in that population is no higher than the general population. So maybe this isn't such a crazy, that kind of thing.
Yeah. 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 Okay. Thank you so much. This has been great. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Keep up the good work getting all this message out to people.
Yeah.